Welcome to Lore to Mystery, where we dive deep into history's most perplexing, unsolved cases and vanishings that continue to haunt us decades later. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of America's most disturbing mysteries, a case that begins on Christmas Eve 1945 and spans 80 years of unanswered questions, grief, and an unrelenting search for truth. This is the story of 5 children who vanished in the night, leaving behind no trace, no remains, and a family that would spend the rest of their lives refusing to accept the official explanation. Picture this. It's Christmas morning, 1945. You're driving through the mountains of West Virginia as dawn breaks, and you pass a pile of smoking rubble where a house used to stand. A family stands in the frigid December air, staring at the ruins, but something's wrong. The parents aren't mourning 5 children who died in the fire. They're frantically searching for 5 children who vanished without leaving behind a single bone, a single tooth, a single trace of human remains. And over the next 4 decades, they'll spend every penny they have and every waking moment trying to answer one haunting question. Did their children die in that fire, or did someone take them? This is the story of the Sodder Children, one of America's most baffling, unsolved mysteries. It's a case filled with threatening insurance salesmen, Mafia connections, mysterious phone calls, planted evidence, and sightings of the missing children that would continue for decades. It's a story that begins on Christmas Eve in 1945 and doesn't truly end until 2021, when the last surviving Sodder sibling died without ever learning what happened to her brothers and sisters. The Sodder family, the American dream. To understand this mystery, we need to understand the Sodder family. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddu in Tula, Sardinia, Italy, in 1895. At just 13 years old, in 1908, he made the journey to Ellis Island with an older brother. But when they arrived in America, something unexpected happened. His older brother immediately turned around and went back to Italy, leaving young George completely alone in a new country where he didn't speak the language. Most 13-year-olds would have been crushed by this abandonment, but George was made of tougher stuff. He found work on the Pennsylvania railroads, carrying water and supplies to the laborers. It was back-breaking work for a child, but George saved every penny he could. After several years, he moved to Smithers, West Virginia, drawn by opportunities in the coal country. George was smart and ambitious. He didn't stay a laborer for long. He worked his way up to driver, then launched his own trucking company, hauling dirt for construction projects and later freight and coal. He was building something real, something his family back in Sardinia could never have imagined. One day, George walked into a local store in Smithers called The Music Box, and his life changed forever. Behind the counter was Jennie Cipriani, the store owner's daughter. Jennie had also come from Italy, arriving when she was just 3 years old. She was beautiful, hardworking, and shared George's determination to build a good life in America. George and Jennie fell in love and married in 1922. They settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, about 2 miles outside of town. Fayetteville was a small Appalachian community with a thriving Italian immigrant population, and the Sodders fit right in. Over the next 2 decades, Jennie gave birth to 10 children: Joe, John, George Jr., Marion, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, and Sylvia. By all accounts, the Sodders were living the American dream. George's trucking business prospered. They built a comfortable 2-story wood frame house. They were respected members of their community. Their children were healthy, well-behaved, and did well in school. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they had more than enough. They had each other, they had a future, and they had hope. But George had one trait that would come back to haunt him. He was outspoken about politics. Specifically, he was vocally, passionately opposed to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. While many Italian immigrants in the area still had loyalty to their homeland, and some even admired Mussolini's fascist government, George would have none of it. He called Mussolini a tyrant and a criminal. He spoke out against the fascist regime at every opportunity. By 1945, Mussolini had been deposed and executed by Italian partisans at the end of the war in Europe. But the hard feelings George had stirred up in his community didn't die with Il Duce. Some people in Fayetteville, particularly those in the Italian immigrant community who had supported Mussolini, resented George's outspoken criticism. They saw it as disloyal, as turning his back on his heritage. These tensions would simmer beneath the surface until Christmas Eve 1945. Warnings and omens. The last months of 1945 should have been a time of celebration for the Sodder family. World War II had ended. Their oldest son, Joe, who was 17 when he left to serve in the military, would soon be coming home. The war that had torn the world apart was finally over, and they could all be together again for Christmas. But starting in October 1945, a series of disturbing events began to occur. Events that, in hindsight, seemed like warnings that something terrible was about to happen. First came the insurance salesman. In October, a man showed up at the Sodder house, trying to sell George life insurance. George declined the offer. He'd had the same policy for years and saw no reason to change it. But the insurance salesman didn't take rejection well. He became irate, his face turning red with anger. Then he said something chilling. "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to pay for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just an angry comment, it was a specific, detailed threat. The house would burn. The children would be destroyed. And it would happen because of George's political opinions. George was unsettled by the threat, but he didn't report it to police. Perhaps he thought it was just an empty threat from an angry salesman who'd lost a commission. Perhaps he didn't want to make waves in the community. But he would remember those words 2 months later, when his house was indeed engulfed in flames. The second warning came from a man seeking work. A stranger appeared at the Sodder house claiming he was looking for odd jobs. George said he didn't have any work for him. But instead of leaving, the man wandered to the back of the house. When he returned, he pointed at 2 fuse boxes and said something strange. "This is going to cause a fire someday." George was puzzled. He'd just had the entire house rewired when they installed a new electric stove. The local electric company had inspected everything and pronounced it completely safe. Why would a stranger make such a specific prediction about an electrical fire? George mentioned it to Jennie, but again, they didn't pursue it further. The third warning was even more unsettling. In December, the weeks leading up to Christmas, several of the older Sodder children noticed something odd. There was a strange car that would park along the main highway through town, and the people inside weren't just sitting there, they were watching. Specifically, they were watching the younger Sodder children as they walked home from school. The children mentioned it to their parents. George and Jennie were concerned, but what could they do? The car wasn't on their property. The occupants weren't approaching the children. Perhaps it was just paranoia. Perhaps it was nothing. In hindsight, of course, none of it was nothing. All of these events, these warnings, these threats, were building towards something. But the Sodders had no way of knowing that on Christmas Eve 1945, their worst nightmare was about to begin. Christmas Eve, 1945. Christmas Eve in the Sodder household started out as a joyful occasion. Marion, the 17-year-old daughter, had been working at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville. She'd saved up her wages and surprised her younger sisters, Martha, 12, Jennie, 8, and Betty, 5, with new toys. The little girls were ecstatic. They begged their mother to let them stay up past their bedtime to play with their new gifts. Jennie relented. It was Christmas Eve after all. She told the children they could stay up a little later, but she made them promise one thing: the 2 oldest boys still awake, 14-year-old Maurice and 9-year-old Louis, had to remember to put the cows in the barn and feed the chickens before they went to bed. The children agreed. George and the 2 oldest boys, John, 23, and George Jr., 16, had spent the day working at the family's trucking business. They were exhausted and went to bed early. At 10 p.m., Jennie took the youngest child, 2-year-old Sylvia, upstairs with her and went to bed. She told the children still awake that they needed to finish their chores and get to bed soon. Then she kissed them goodnight, turned out some of the lights, and headed upstairs. The house settled into the quiet of Christmas Eve. Outside, snow blanketed the West Virginia mountains. Inside, 5 children played with their new toys. The Christmas tree lights twinkled, and everything seemed perfect. The Sodders didn't know it, but these would be the last peaceful moments they would ever have as a complete family. The strange phone call. At 12:30 a.m., just after midnight on Christmas morning, Jennie woke up to the sound of the telephone ringing. She went downstairs to answer it. On the other end was a woman's voice that she didn't recognize. The woman asked for someone whose name Jennie didn't know. It was clearly a wrong number, but there was something odd about the call. In the background, Jennie could hear laughter, loud voices, and the clinking of glasses, as if the woman was calling from a party. The woman made no apology for the late-night call or the wrong number. She just laughed, that strange, cackling laugh, and hung up. Jennie stood there for a moment, confused. Who calls at 12:30 in the morning? And why was the woman laughing? She shook off the strange feeling and headed back to bed. But as she walked through the living room, she noticed something that bothered her. All the downstairs lights were still on. The curtains were still open. The front door was unlocked. Marion had fallen asleep on the sofa, but the younger children had apparently gone to bed without finishing their chores or turning off the lights. Jennie closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and locked the door. She looked in on Marion and Sylvia, who were both sleeping peacefully. Then she went back to bed, but she couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling the phone call had given her. Something felt off, wrong somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Half an hour later, at approximately 1 a.m., Jennie woke again. This time she heard a loud thud on the roof, followed by a rolling sound, as if something had hit the roof and rolled down the side of the house. She listened for a moment, but heard nothing else. Perhaps a tree branch had fallen, perhaps it was nothing. She dozed off again. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Jennie woke for the 3rd time, but this time, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The air in the bedroom was thick with smoke. She could smell it, taste it, and as she bolted upright in bed, she could see the orange glow of flames coming from downstairs. "Fire!" she screamed. "George, the house is on fire." The desperate rescue attempt. George jumped out of bed immediately. The smoke was already thick in their bedroom. He grabbed Sylvia from her crib while Jennie threw the bedroom door open. The hallway outside, their room, which led to the staircase, was filled with smoke and flames. They could see that the fire had consumed George's office downstairs and was spreading rapidly through the 1st floor. George and Jennie ran down the stairs with Sylvia, shouting for their other children as loud as they could. "Wake up! Fire! Get out of the house!" They pounded on doors, screamed names, doing everything they could to alert the children upstairs. Marion woke up on the sofa in the living room and grabbed Sylvia from her mother. George Jr. and John, who shared an upstairs bedroom near the staircase, ran down the stairs, their hair singeing from the heat. But as they rushed down, they had to run right past flames that were already climbing the staircase. There was no way for the children in the other upstairs rooms to get down. The staircase was an inferno. George didn't hesitate. He ran outside, planning to grab his ladder and reach the children through the upstairs windows. The ladder was always kept propped against the side of the house, ready for use. But when George got to where it should have been, his heart dropped. The ladder was gone. Completely gone. He searched frantically, but it was nowhere to be found. No problem, he thought. He'd use his trucks. George ran to his 2 coal trucks, which were parked near the house. He'd drive them close to the house and climb on top of them to reach the upstairs windows. But when he tried to start the first truck, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't turn over. He tried again. Nothing. He ran to the second truck. Same thing. Both trucks, which had worked perfectly fine the day before, were completely dead. The reality of the situation began to crash over George. His children were trapped upstairs. He could hear them screaming, or thought he could, though the roar of the flames made it hard to tell. He had no ladder. His trucks wouldn't start. He ran to the rain barrel they kept for emergencies, thinking he could at least try to throw water on the fire. The water was frozen solid. In desperation, George ran back toward the house. He broke a window with his bare hands, slicing a deep gash in his arm that sent blood running down to his fingers. He tried to climb through, but the smoke and flames drove him back. He couldn't see anything inside, he couldn't breathe, and he could no longer hear any screams from upstairs. George, Jennie, Marion, John, George Jr., and little Sylvia could do nothing but stand in the freezing December night and watch their home burn. 5 children were still inside: Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, and Betty, 5. 5 children who should have been opening presents in just a few hours. 5 children who were now trapped in a burning building with no way out. Or were they? The delayed response. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department, but when she picked up the phone, there was no operator. The phone line appeared to be dead or out of service. She tried again and again. Nothing. Another neighbor, seeing the fire, drove to a nearby tavern to call for help. He had the same problem. No operator response. Finally, a neighbor drove all the way into town to physically find Fire Chief F.J. Maurice and alert him that the Sodder house was burning and children were trapped inside. This was at approximately 1 p.m. The fire department was just 2 miles away from the Sodder house. 2 miles. In good conditions, the fire trucks could have been there in minutes, but the fire department didn't arrive until 8 a.m., 7 hours after they were first notified. 7 hours. Later, the fire department would offer various excuses. It was Christmas Eve and many firefighters had gone home to be with their families, leaving only a skeleton crew. Fire Chief Maurice himself couldn't drive the fire truck and had to wait until he could find someone qualified to operate it. They didn't have a fire siren in Fayetteville at that time, so they had to use a phone tree, calling firefighters one by one to assemble them. It was a small volunteer department with limited resources. All of these excuses might be understandable, but 7 hours for a fire just 2 miles away with children reportedly trapped inside. The Sodders would never believe it was simple incompetence. They would become convinced that the delayed response was deliberate, that someone had made sure the fire department wouldn't arrive in time to save their children or recover their bodies. By the time the fire trucks finally arrived at 8 a.m., there was nothing left to fight. The 2-story house had completely collapsed. All that remained was the basement filled with ashes and charred rubble. The fire was out. The morning sun was rising over the mountains, and the Sodder family stood in shock, staring at the ruins of their home and their lives. The missing remains, Fire Chief Maurice and the firefighters conducted a cursory search of the debris. In modern fire investigations, officials will spend days or even weeks carefully sifting through the remains of a structure fire, especially one where fatalities are suspected. They use sieves and screens to find even the smallest bone fragments, teeth, jewelry, anything that might remain. But in 1945, in a small West Virginia town, the investigation was far less thorough. The firefighters poked through the rubble for about 2 hours. At approximately 10 a.m., Chief Maurice came to George and Jennie with shocking news. "We haven't found any bones," he said. "No remains at all." George and Jennie were stunned. How could 5 children burn to death and leave no trace? Chief Maurice had an explanation. The fire must have been extraordinarily hot, he said. Hot enough to completely cremate the bodies. The children's remains had been reduced to ash so fine that they had blown away or sifted through the debris into the basement. Some accounts suggest that Maurice did find a few small bone fragments and possibly some internal organs, but chose not to tell the family. The search, by modern standards, was cursory at best. Maurice told George to leave the site undisturbed so the state fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation later. But George couldn't bear it. For 4 days, he and Jennie stood near the ruins, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but stare at the place where their children had died. On the 4th day, George couldn't take it anymore. He brought in a bulldozer and covered the entire site with 5 feet of dirt from a vacant lot. He and Jennie would plant flowers there, creating a memorial garden for their lost children. A local coroner convened an inquest. The fire was quickly determined to have been caused by faulty electrical wiring. Never mind that George had just had the house rewired and inspected. Never mind that the Christmas tree lights had remained on throughout the early stages of the fire, which shouldn't have been possible if an electrical fault had caused it. The official cause was faulty wiring. On December 30th, 1945, just 6 days after the fire, the coroner's office issued death certificates for all 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. The cause of death was listed as fire or suffocation. The section for burial, cremation, or removal listed burial, with the date of December 27th, 1945. The cemetery location was listed as the Sodder's own address. The children had been buried, the certificates claimed, in the basement of their own home, under 5 feet of dirt. Interestingly, one of the members of the coroner's jury was the insurance salesman who had threatened George 2 months earlier, the one who had specifically predicted that George's house would burn and his children would be destroyed. This same man had a financial interest in the case because he was a co-signer on the family's home insurance. Even more suspicious, he had increased the insurance coverage from $2,500 to $1,750 just before the fire, without the Sodders' knowledge or consent. For most people, this would have been the end of the story, a tragic house fire on Christmas Eve. 5 children dead, a family destroyed. But George and Jennie Sodder were not most people. And as the weeks passed and they had time to think about everything that had happened, they began to realize that nothing about this fire made sense. Nothing at all. The doubts begin. Jennie Sodder was an intelligent, practical woman, and she knew one thing for certain. 5 children could not burn to death in a house fire and leave absolutely no remains. It was physically impossible. So she decided to conduct her own experiment. Jennie took bones from chickens and other livestock and burned them in her oven and in outdoor fires, trying to recreate the conditions of the house fire. No matter how hot she made the fire or how long she burned them, the bones never completely turned to ash. There were always fragments left, recognizable as bones. If chicken bones wouldn't completely disintegrate in a fire, how could 5 human skeletons? She spoke to a local crematorium operator who confirmed her suspicions. Even in a crematorium, where bodies are deliberately cremated at temperatures between 1,400 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 2 hours, bones don't disappear. They fragment, but they remain. Cremated human remains, what we call ashes, are actually ground up bone fragments. And crematoriums use special equipment to reach those intense temperatures. A typical house fire burns at around 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Sodder house had burned for only about 45 minutes before collapsing completely. It was not hot enough and didn't burn long enough to completely cremate even one body, let alone 5. If the children had died in the fire, there should have been recognizable skeletal remains, teeth, anything. But there was nothing. George, meanwhile, was questioning other aspects of the official story. If the fire had been caused by faulty wiring, why were the Christmas tree lights still on? An electrical fire severe enough to destroy the house would have shut off all power immediately. Yet, multiple witnesses, including the family members who escaped, confirmed that the outdoor Christmas lights had remained lit throughout the early stages of the fire. And what about all the things that had gone wrong during their rescue attempts? George kept a ladder against the house specifically for emergencies. It had been there for years. Who would take it? And why? His trucks had worked perfectly the day before. He'd driven them multiple times. Yet, on the night of the fire, when he desperately needed them, both were completely inoperable. Was that just terrible luck? Or had someone sabotaged them? A telephone repairman later examined the lines and reported they appeared to have been cut rather than burned. A witness reported seeing a man stealing a block and tackle from the Sodders' property. This man was later identified and arrested, and he admitted to cutting the phone line, though he claimed he thought it was a power line. Whether this was genuinely accidental or part of a larger plan remains unclear. The wrong number phone call Jennie received at 12:30 a.m. initially seemed suspicious, but investigators later traced and interviewed the woman who made it. She confirmed it had been a genuine wrong number. She'd been at a party and had simply dialed incorrectly. While the timing seems eerie, there's no evidence connecting this call to the events that followed. What about the thud on the roof and the rolling sound Jennie heard? In spring of 1946, when the snow melted, young Sylvia found something in the yard near where the house had stood. It was a small, hard, dark, green, rubber, ball-like object. George examined it carefully. He'd served in the military and seen combat equipment. To him, the object looked like a pineapple bomb, hand grenade, or some type of napalm incendiary device. Could this be what Jennie heard hit the roof? Most damning of all were the sightings that were beginning to come in. People were claiming to have seen the Sodder children after the fire. Not ghosts, not people who resembled the children. The actual Sodder children, alive and well. The sightings begin. The first sighting came from a bus driver who had driven past the Sodder house late on Christmas Eve. He came forward weeks after the fire and told the Sodders something incredible. As he drove by, he saw people throwing what looked like balls of fire at the house. Incendiary devices, firebombs. Someone had deliberately set the Sodder house on fire. Then came even more shocking reports. A woman who operated a tourist stop near Charleston, West Virginia, told the Sodders that she had seen their children on the morning of Christmas Day, just hours after the fire. She was absolutely certain. 5 children, looking frightened and disheveled, in a car with 2 men who appeared to be of Italian descent. The children looked exactly like the pictures in the newspaper. Another woman, who worked at a hotel in Charleston, came forward with an even more detailed account. She claimed she had seen 4 of the 5 missing Sodder children approximately a week after the fire. They were with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be Italian. The adults seemed hostile and nervous when the hotel worker looked at the children too closely. The woman was so certain of what she'd seen that she signed an affidavit. Other sightings poured in. A woman in Florida claimed to have seen the Sodder children. Someone reported seeing them in Texas. Another person said they'd seen at least one of the children at a tourist attraction in South Carolina. And a woman in St. Louis wrote to say that the oldest girl, Martha, was living in a convent there. The Sodders didn't know what to make of all this. Were these sightings real? Were people seeing what they wanted to see, trying to give a grieving family hope? Or had something truly impossible happened? Had the children been kidnapped and the fire set as a diversion? George and Jennie began to develop a theory. George's outspoken opposition to Mussolini had made enemies in the Italian immigrant community. Based on the threatening statements and the sightings of the children with Italian adults, they came to believe that someone connected to supporters of the former fascist regime may have decided to punish him. The possibility that the Sicilian Mafia, with its long reach and connections within immigrant communities, could have been involved seemed far-fetched. But when they examined the coordinated nature of the events, the cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the sabotaged trucks, the incendiary devices, it suggested a level of planning that pointed to organized involvement, rather than random tragedy. The children had not died in that fire. Someone had taken them, and that someone had gone to elaborate lengths to make it look like an accident. The investigation that never was in 1947, George and Jennie wrote to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, begging for help. They laid out all the evidence, all the inconsistencies, all the reasons they believed their children had been kidnapped. Surely the FBI, with its resources and expertise, could find the truth. They received a response from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, but it wasn't the help they'd hoped for. Hoover wrote that while he would like to be of service, the matter appeared to be of local character and did not come within the investigative jurisdiction of the FBI. The Bureau's agents would assist if they could get permission from local authorities, but when the FBI approached the Fayetteville police and fire departments, both declined the offer of federal assistance. Why would local authorities refuse FBI help? In a case involving 5 missing children, the Sodders had their suspicions. Incompetence was one possibility. Chief Maurice had already demonstrated serious problems in his handling of the fire. Perhaps he didn't want federal investigators pointing out all his mistakes, but there might have been darker reasons. Perhaps people in positions of power in Fayetteville had been involved in what happened that night and didn't want anyone looking too closely. With the authorities offering no help, the Sodders turned to private investigators. The first one they hired was named C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Gawley Bridge, and Tinsley quickly discovered things that made the case even more suspicious. First, Tinsley confirmed what the Sodders had suspected. The insurance salesman who had threatened George was a member of the coroner's jury that had ruled the fire accidental. A man who had publicly threatened that George's house would burn and his children would be destroyed had helped determine that the fire was an accident. The conflict of interest was staggering. Then, Tinsley uncovered an even more bizarre piece of evidence. He heard rumors that Fire Chief Maurice had told a local minister something in confidence. Maurice claimed he had found human remains in the fire, specifically a heart, but instead of reporting this to the family or preserving it as evidence, Maurice said he had packed the heart into a metal box and secretly buried it on the property. When Tinsley confronted Maurice with this information, the fire chief admitted it was true. He agreed to show George and Tinsley where he had buried the box. They dug it up and took it to a local funeral director for examination. The funeral director examined the contents carefully, then delivered shocking news. The object in the box was not a human heart. It was fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Think about the implications of this. The fire chief, the man responsible for investigating the fire and determining the fate of the missing children, had planted false evidence. He had deliberately buried beef liver in the ruins and told people it was a child's heart. Why would he do this? Maurice's explanation was that he wanted to give the family closure, to convince them their children had died so they could move on with their lives. But this makes no sense. He never told the family about finding the heart. He buried it secretly and only confessed months later to a minister. If his goal was to give the family closure, why hide the evidence? A more sinister interpretation is that Maurice was trying to create false proof that the children had died in the fire, evidence that could be discovered later if questions continued to be raised. When a funeral director quickly identified it as beef liver, the cover-up fell apart. The 1949 excavation, the Sodders refused to give up. In 1949, they hired a pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter from Washington, D.C., to conduct a professional excavation of the site. Hunter and his team carefully dug through the 5 feet of dirt George had bulldozed over the ruins. They sifted through the debris systematically, looking for any evidence of human remains. They found coins that had been damaged by fire. They found the burned remains of a dictionary that had belonged to the children, and they found 4 small bone fragments that appeared to be vertebrae. The bone fragments were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report came back with fascinating and disturbing findings. The bones were indeed human vertebrae, all from the same individual. Based on the skeletal maturation, the person had been between 16 and 22 years old at the time of death. The report noted it was possible, although not probable, for a 14-year-old boy to show the skeletal maturation of a 16 or 17-year-old, meaning the bones could potentially have belonged to Maurice, the oldest missing child. But here's where it gets even stranger. The report explicitly stated that the vertebrae showed no evidence that they had been exposed to fire. None. The bones had not been burned. How could bones from a child who allegedly died in a house fire show no fire damage? Furthermore, the report noted that it was very strange that only 4 vertebrae were found. A human spine has 33 vertebrae. If one of the children had died in the fire, where were all the other bones? A fire that burned for 45 minutes should have left complete skeletons, or at least major portions of skeletons. Finding just 4 vertebrae, none of them burned, made no sense whatsoever. The Smithsonian report concluded that the vertebrae had most likely come from the dirt that George had used to bulldoze the site. They hadn't been in the house during the fire at all. Someone had used fill dirt that already contained bones, perhaps from a cemetery or burial ground, and those bones had been mixed in with the debris when the site was covered. Later, investigator Tinsley supposedly confirmed this theory. He claimed the bone fragments had come from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope. But he could never explain how they got from a cemetery to the Sodder site, or why they would be in the fill dirt. The investigation and its findings attracted national attention. The West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. Afterward, however, Governor O.K.L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett delivered a devastating verdict. They told the Sodders their search was hopeless and officially closed the case at the state level. The message was clear. The state believed the children had died in the fire, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would change their minds. The case was closed. The Sodders were on their own. The billboard. In 1952, 7 years after the fire, George and Jennie made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would never stop looking for their children, and they would make sure everyone in West Virginia knew about the case. They erected a massive billboard along State Route 16, right near the site where their house had stood. The billboard was impossible to miss. It featured large black and white photographs of all 5 missing children: Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, and Betty, 5. Their solemn faces stared out at every car that passed. Below the photos were their names, ages, and a question that would haunt everyone who saw it. What was their fate? The billboard offered a reward for information, initially $5,000. The Sodders soon doubled it to $10,000, an enormous sum in the 1950s. The message was clear: the Sodder parents believed their children were alive, and they would pay dearly for any information that would help find them. The billboard also included text that made the Sodders' suspicions clear. One version read, "These children were kidnapped on Christmas Eve 1945 and the house set on fire to cover the crime." Another version asked, "Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive?" For locals in Fayetteville, the billboard became a landmark. Everyone knew about the Sodder children. The story was passed down through generations. People would drive by and point it out to their children, telling the story of the Christmas fire and the missing children. Some people would pull over and stand in front of the billboard, staring up at the faces of those 5 children, wondering what could have possibly happened to them. Lewis A. Cook, the official town historian of Fayetteville, recalled in an interview, "I grew up driving by their sign for many years. It became a kind of landmark in the area, and even those who didn't know the details of the 1945 fire knew about the mystery." The billboard stood for nearly 4 decades, through sun and rain and snow, the photos fading but the question never answered. It stood as a monument to a family's refusal to accept the official story, their determination to keep searching, their absolute conviction that their children had not died in that fire. And the billboard worked. Tips and sightings continued to come in, though none would lead to the children. But in 1968, more than 2 decades after the fire, some accounts place this in 1967, the Sodders received what they believed was their best lead yet. The mysterious photograph. One day in 1968, Jennie went to check the mail and found an envelope addressed to her. It had been postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, but there was no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man who appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. Jennie's hands began to shake as she looked at the photograph. The man had dark, curly hair and deep brown eyes. He had a straight, strong nose and an upward tilt to his left eyebrow. The facial features, the bone structure, everything about him reminded her powerfully of Louis, her son who had been 9 years old when he disappeared. This man was exactly what Louis would look like now if he were still alive. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, someone had written in handwriting, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Elil boys. A90132 or 35. Jennie and George examined the photo for hours, comparing it to pictures of Louis as a child. The resemblance was undeniable. Beyond the general features, there were specific similarities. The same tilt to the eyebrow, the same nose, the same eyes. Could this really be their Louis? After 22 years, had he finally found a way to contact them? But the message on the back was puzzling. Louis didn't have a brother named Frankie. The Sodder boys were Joe, John, George Jr., and Maurice. Who was Frankie, unless it was a code, or a reference to someone else? Jennie's brother, one of her siblings from Italy, was named Frank. Was the message saying Louis loved his Uncle Frankie? And what did Ilil boys mean? Was it a misspelling, code? And the numbers A90132 or 35, what could those refer to? A prison number? A military serial number? An address? The Sodders were convinced they'd finally gotten the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. They hired another private investigator and gave him money to travel to Kentucky to follow up on the lead. Find the man in the photo, find out if he's really Louis, find out who sent the letter. The private investigator took the money and left for Kentucky. And then he vanished. The Sodders never heard from him again. They tried to find him, tried to track down where he'd gone, but he had disappeared, as completely as their children had. Some people believe the investigator simply took the money and ran, that he had no intention of actually investigating anything. Others wonder if he found something that got him killed or frightened him into hiding. Whatever happened, the lead went cold. But the Sodders never stopped believing the photograph was real. George and Jennie updated their billboard to include the adult photo of Louis, placing it alongside the childhood pictures. They hung an enlarged version over their fireplace. For the rest of their lives, they would look at that photo and see their son, alive somewhere, unable to come home. The photograph remains one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. Modern facial recognition technology could potentially determine if the man in the photo could be Louis Sodder at the right age. But by the time such technology existed, the original photo had been lost or damaged beyond use. All that remains are copies of copies, too degraded for meaningful analysis. To this day, no one knows who sent the photo, who the man was, or what the cryptic message meant. Was it really Louis reaching out to his family after more than 2 decades? Was it someone's cruel hoax? Or was it a more sinister message from whoever had taken the children? Proof that they were still being held, still alive? Theories and speculation. Over the decades since the fire, investigators, researchers, and the Sodder family themselves have proposed various theories to explain what happened. While we have established facts from the case, the complete truth remains unknown, leaving room for different interpretations of the evidence. Each theory attempts to reconcile the known facts with possible explanations, though none can be proven conclusively. Theory 1: the children died in the fire. This is the official explanation, though it faces significant challenges from a scientific standpoint. For the children to have died in the fire and left no remains whatsoever, several conditions would need to align. First, the fire would need to have burned hot enough and long enough to completely destroy 5 bodies, something fire science experts indicate is virtually impossible in a residential structure fire that lasted only 45 minutes. Crematoriums, which are specifically designed for this purpose and operate at temperatures between 1,400 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 2 hours, still leave bone fragments that must be mechanically processed. A typical house fire burns at around 1,100 degrees. Second, we would need to account for why the electrical fire didn't cut power to the Christmas lights, a detail multiple witnesses confirmed. We would need to explain the disappearance of the latter, the simultaneous failure of both trucks, the severed phone lines, and the lack of operator response to emergency calls. The threatening statements made before the fire would need to be dismissed as unfortunate coincidences. The multiple sightings of the children after the fire would need to be attributed to cases of mistaken identity. And Fire Chief Maurice's decision to plant false evidence would need some explanation beyond the one he gave. While it's possible that a combination of unusual circumstances, investigation failures, and traumatized witness accounts could explain these elements, the convergence of so many improbable factors makes this theory difficult to reconcile with the physical evidence. Theory 2: the Mafia kidnapping. This is the theory George and Jennie came to believe most strongly. George's vocal opposition to Mussolini had created genuine animosity in parts of the Italian immigrant community. The evidence that points toward this possibility is substantial. The timing and nature of the threats are difficult to dismiss. The insurance salesman's specific prediction about the house burning and the children being destroyed, made 2 months before it happened, suggests foreknowledge. The coordinated sabotage, cut phone lines, missing ladder, disabled trucks, indicates planning rather than accident. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the children with Italian adults after the fire, and the insurance salesman who made the threats was later found to be on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental, suggesting at minimum a conflict of interest and potentially something more troubling. If this theory holds, it would suggest a coordinated operation, disable communication and escape routes, set the fire with incendiary devices, and remove the children during the chaos. The children could have been kept alive and hidden, perhaps raised in Italian families with Mafia connections, as a form of ongoing punishment, leaving George and Jennie in perpetual uncertainty about their children's fate. The challenges with this theory are primarily practical. Kidnapping and concealing 5 children for decades would require extensive resources, absolute loyalty from multiple participants, and extraordinary luck. Someone would eventually talk, make a mistake, or have a crisis of conscience. Additionally, if the goal was purely revenge, why keep the children alive rather than ensuring they died in the fire, unless the cruelty of uncertainty, of never knowing, was itself the intended punishment? Theory 3. Human trafficking. A related but distinct possibility involves illegal adoption or human trafficking networks. In the 1940s, black market adoptions were more common than is often acknowledged. Children would be taken or purchased and placed with families who wanted to adopt, but couldn't, through legitimate channels. Criminal networks sometimes facilitated these transactions. 5 healthy children from a respectable family would have represented significant value in such a network. The fire could have provided cover for the disappearance. If everyone believed the children died, no one would be actively searching for them alive. The children could have been transported quickly out of state and placed with adoptive families who might have been told the children were orphans or came from parents who couldn't care for them. This theory could explain the post-fire sightings, particularly those involving Italian adults with the children who appeared nervous when observed. It would explain why the children never returned. If they were given new identities and raised by families who believed the adoptions were legitimate, the children themselves might never have known they were the Sodders. The 1968 photograph could represent one of the children discovering or suspecting the truth and attempting to make contact. The limitation of this theory is that it doesn't fully account for the elaborate nature of the fire and sabotage. If the goal was simply to obtain children for adoption, why go to such lengths? Why not take the children through less spectacular means? Unless the operation had connections to those with grudges against George and served multiple purposes. Theory 4. The children escaped but died. A less commonly proposed theory suggests the children might have escaped through windows, but then succumbed to the elements. West Virginia in late December can be brutally cold, with temperatures well below freezing. If the children managed to exit through upstairs windows but were disoriented from smoke inhalation or traumatized by the fire, they could have wandered into the surrounding woods and died from exposure. However, this theory faces substantial challenges. Multiple family members remained outside the burning house throughout the fire, maintaining clear sight lines to the structure. They would likely have seen or heard the children if they jumped from windows. Furthermore, if the children had died in the nearby woods, their bodies would have been discovered during the searches conducted in the area in the days and weeks following the fire. The terrain, while mountainous, wasn't so remote that 5 children's remains would have gone completely undiscovered. Theory 5. Insurance fraud gone wrong. This fringe theory has been proposed by some skeptics who suggest George himself might have been involved in an insurance fraud scheme that went catastrophically wrong. However, this theory lacks supporting evidence and creates more questions than it answers. It doesn't account for the specific threats made before the fire by the insurance salesman, the planted false evidence after, or George and Jennie's decades of genuine grief and exhaustive search efforts. The family's financial investment in private investigators and the billboard alone would have far exceeded any insurance payout. This theory has largely been dismissed by serious investigators of the case. What really happened? After examining all the evidence, testimony, and theories collected over 80 years, we can establish certain facts with confidence, though the complete truth remains elusive. Here's what the documented evidence tells us. 5 children were present in the Sodder house when a fire started in the early morning hours of December 25, 1945. The fire destroyed the house within approximately 45 minutes. The children were never verifiably seen again by their immediate family. No human remains conclusively identified as belonging to the children were ever found at the fire scene, a fact that fire science experts find highly unusual. George and Jennie Sodder spent the rest of their lives believing their children had been kidnapped, and they never accepted the official ruling that the children died in the fire. Beyond these established facts, interpretation becomes necessary. Did the children perish in the fire? Fire science suggests this is improbable, given the absence of any remains. For 5 bodies to be completely destroyed would require conditions that a 45-minute residential fire is unlikely to produce. However, this doesn't make it impossible, merely highly unlikely based on our understanding of fire dynamics and human remains. Were the children kidnapped? The circumstantial evidence is compelling. Premeditated threats, coordinated sabotage of rescue efforts, cut phone lines, incendiary devices, and multiple witness reports of children matching their descriptions seen alive after the fire. Yet conclusive proof of kidnapping has never emerged. If the children were taken and raised elsewhere, the question remains why at least one never came forward once they reached adulthood. Could some combination of events have occurred? Perhaps some children perished while others were taken, or perhaps the true explanation involves factors we haven't yet considered. The frustrating reality is that we may never know with certainty. Too much time has passed, too much evidence has been lost or destroyed, and too many potential witnesses have died. The Sodder Children case may remain permanently in that category of unsolved mysteries where we know something terrible happened, but the complete truth stays just beyond our reach. As the decades passed, the Sodder family never stopped searching, but hope became harder to maintain. George and Jennie aged, their grief etching deeper lines into their faces with each passing year. The surviving children grew up, married, and had children of their own, but the shadow of Christmas 1945 never left them. In 1967, another lead came that seemed promising. The family received a letter from a woman in Houston, Texas, who claimed she had encountered Louis and Maurice at a bar. She said Louis had been drinking and confessed to her that they were the missing Sodder brothers. George's son-in-law, Grover Paxton, drove with George to Texas to investigate. They found and spoke to the 2 men the woman had indicated, but the men denied they were the Sodder brothers. They insisted the woman was mistaken. George came away from the encounter uncertain. Years later, Paxton told reporters that he thought George had doubts about the denial. I think there was always some doubt in his mind. He died shortly thereafter, in 1969, and I think he always wondered if those were his boys. George Sodder died on August 16, 1969, at the age of 73. He had spent the last 24 years of his life searching for his children, following leads across the country, hiring investigators, maintaining the billboard, refusing to accept that they were gone. He died never knowing what had happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. Jennie continued the search alone. She kept living in Fayetteville, in a house she had built near the site of the fire. She put up a fence around the property. She wore black in mourning for the rest of her life. She tended the memorial garden where the old house had stood, the flowers growing over the spot where 5 children had either died or vanished. Jennie kept answering the phone, kept responding to every letter, kept hoping that one day the phone would ring, and it would be one of her lost children calling to say they were coming home. She kept the billboard maintained, though by now it was weathered and faded, a ghost of what it had been. Jennie Sodder died on June 17, 1989, at the age of 87. She had spent 44 years searching for her children, never giving up hope. never accepting the official explanation. Shortly after her death, the surviving children took down the billboard that had stood for nearly 4 decades. It had done its job, keeping the case in the public eye, but now both parents were gone. The time had come to let it rest. But the surviving Sodder children didn't stop looking. John, George Jr., Marion, and Sylvia continued to publicize the case, continued to investigate new leads, continued to hope that somehow, some way, they might learn the truth. They were joined by their own children, the grandchildren of George and Jennie, who had grown up with the mystery as part of their family history. The 21st century. In the modern era, the Sodder Children case found new life on the internet. True crime forums, podcasts, and websites began examining the evidence with fresh eyes. The case was featured on History Channel's History's Greatest Mysteries in April 2021. Articles appeared in major publications. The mystery fascinated a new generation of amateur investigators. In 2013, Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the last surviving Sodder sibling, who was present the night of the fire, gave an interview to the Charleston Gazette-Mail. She was 71 years old by then. She told the reporter that the fire was her earliest memory. "I was the last one of the kids to leave home," she recalled. She had spent her entire life helping her parents, then continuing on her own to find her missing siblings. She had never stopped believing they survived that night. "I experienced their grief for a long time," she said. Sylvia's daughter, Jennie Henthorne, named after her grandmother and one of the missing children, helped keep the story alive. She described growing up with the mystery as an ever-present part of their family. "It was part of our family growing up. It wasn't something that my brother and I realized was abnormal because it was just always there. We'd go visit my grandmother at least once a week. We went usually on Sunday, and we drove in past the billboard every single time. It didn't occur to us that that was something that was unusual or unique to our family." In 2012, George Bragg, an environmental engineer with an interest in true crime, published a book about the case after reading the 2013 article about Sylvia. He had been given a 1950 state fire marshal's office report years earlier and decided to dig deeper. When he filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 2014 to see if there were more files, he was told the agency had no files remaining related to the case. The voluminous cache of documents that had existed in the 1950s had somehow been lost or destroyed. On April 21, 2021, Sylvia Sodder Paxton died at the age of 79 after a long illness. She was the last living person who had been in the Sodder house on the night of the fire. She went to her grave still believing her siblings had survived, still hoping the truth would someday be known. Her obituary noted 5 other siblings were unable to be located following a fire that occurred in December 1945 in their Fayetteville home: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. With Sylvia's death, an era ended. Every person who had direct personal experience of that Christmas Eve night in 1945 was now gone. The missing children, if they somehow survived, would be in their 80s and 90s now. Statistically, they're almost certainly dead by now, even if they lived. The case has moved from living memory into history. But the mystery remains. The questions that George and Jennie asked for more than 4 decades are still unanswered, and perhaps now, they never will be. Modern analysis. Looking at the case with modern investigative techniques and knowledge, several things become clear. First, the initial investigation was catastrophically inadequate. By modern standards, the fire scene was never properly processed. There was no systematic grid search. There was no careful sifting of debris. The fire marshals never conducted the thorough investigation they promised. Evidence was lost, contaminated, or destroyed. Fire Chief Maurice's planting of false evidence would, in a modern context, lead to criminal charges and likely overturn any legal findings related to the case. Second, some of the mysterious elements can be explained with less sinister theories. The wrong number phone call was eventually traced to a neighbor who had simply dialed incorrectly. She was found and interviewed, and there was no indication she was part of any conspiracy. The strange car watching the children might have been nothing more than someone looking at houses in the neighborhood. The object that Sylvia found in the yard might not have been an incendiary device at all. Third, modern fire science has confirmed that complete cremation of human remains in a house fire is essentially impossible. Even in crematoriums designed specifically for the purpose, operating at temperatures far higher than any house fire, bones don't disappear completely. If the children died in the fire, there would be remains. The absence of remains is the single most compelling piece of evidence that something else happened. Fourth, modern forensic techniques could potentially have solved some aspects of the case. DNA testing of the bone fragments found in 1949 could have determined if they came from any of the Sodder children. Modern facial recognition technology could analyze the 1967 photograph to determine the likelihood it was really Louis Sodder. Phone records, if they still existed, might show if someone cut the phone lines deliberately. Contemporary fire investigation techniques could determine more precisely where and how the fire started. But all of these modern techniques require evidence, and most of the evidence is gone. The fire scene was destroyed in 1945. The bone fragments sent to the Smithsonian have been lost. The original photograph has been lost or degraded beyond usefulness. Key witnesses are dead. Documents have been destroyed or lost. The opportunity to solve this case with modern forensics may have passed decades ago. What really happened? After examining all the evidence, all the theories, all the testimony collected over 75 years, what can we say with certainty about what happened to the Sodder children? Here's what we know for sure. 5 children were in the Sodder house when a fire started in the early morning hours of December 25, 1945. The fire destroyed the house. The children were never seen again by their immediate family. No verifiable human remains from the children were ever found at the fire scene. George and Jennie Sodder spent the rest of their lives believing their children had been kidnapped, and they never accepted that the children died in the fire. Everything else is speculation, theory, and possibility. Did the children die in the fire? It's possible, though it would require us to believe that a relatively brief house fire somehow completely cremated 5 bodies, something that fire science suggests is nearly impossible. It would also require us to dismiss or explain away the planted evidence, the sabotaged trucks, the missing ladder, the cut phone lines, and the sightings. Were the children kidnapped? It's possible. The threats before the fire, the suspicious circumstances of the fire itself, the lack of remains, the reported sightings, all of this is consistent with a kidnapping, but kidnapping and hiding 5 children for the rest of their lives would be an enormous undertaking. Why do it? Revenge against George? Profit from illegal adoption or trafficking? And if the children were alive somewhere, why didn't at least one of them ever come forward? Was it some combination of both? Could some of the children have died in the fire while others were taken? This seems unlikely, but might explain why no remains were found, if there were fewer bodies than everyone thought, while also explaining the sightings. The frustrating truth is that we may never know. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence is gone. Too many people who could have provided answers are dead. The Sodder children case may be destined to remain forever in that painful category of unsolved mysteries, cases where we know something terrible happened, but we can never quite piece together exactly what it was. The legacy, the disappearance of the Sodder children remains one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in American history for several reasons. First, it happened during a time when people wanted to believe America was safe, when World War II had ended, and everyone was coming home and building normal lives. The idea that 5 children could vanish on Christmas Eve in a small town where everyone knew everyone shattered that sense of safety. Second, it's a case with just enough evidence to suggest something sinister happened, but not quite enough to prove it. The threats, the suspicious circumstances, the lack of remains, the sightings, all of these elements point towards some kind of conspiracy or crime. But without proof, without answers, we're left in a maddening state of uncertainty. Third, it's a deeply human story. George and Jennie Sodder's refusal to give up, their decades-long search, their billboard along the highway. These become symbols of every parent's worst fear and every parent's undying love. Their story resonates because we can imagine ourselves in their position, can understand the impossible grief of losing a child, combined with the torture of not knowing what happened. The case highlighted serious problems with rural fire investigation in the 1940s. The lack of proper procedures, the inadequate investigation, the potential corruption, all of these issues became clear because the Sodders refused to accept the official explanation. Their advocacy may have led to improvements in how such cases are handled. The Sodder case has been covered in dozens of books, TV shows, documentaries, and podcasts. It's been discussed endlessly on internet forums. Amateur investigators continue to examine the evidence, propose new theories, and search for new leads. The billboard is gone, but the mystery remains very much alive. In Fayetteville today, if you drive along what was once State Route 16, you'll pass the spot where the Sodder house once stood. There's no marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate that this place was the center of one of America's greatest mysteries. A new house sits on or near the site. Life has moved on, but the story hasn't died. Local historian Louis A. Cook notes that most people who knew the Sodders personally, who were firefighters that night, who lived through the events, are now gone. The living memory of the case is fading, but as long as people are interested in mysteries, in unsolved cases, in stories of families searching for truth, the Sodder children will be remembered. Conclusion. It's been 80 years since 5 children disappeared on Christmas morning in 1945. If Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty somehow survived and were hidden away somewhere, they're almost certainly dead by now. Maurice would be 94 years old. Betty would be 85. The window for finding them alive closed decades ago. But the questions remain. What happened in those hours between midnight and dawn on Christmas Day 1945? Where did 5 children go? If they died in the fire, how were their remains so completely destroyed? If they were taken, where were they hidden? Did they know they were the Sodder children? Did they ever try to make contact with their family? Was the photograph sent in 1967 really from Louis, or was it a cruel hoax? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why? If the children were killed, why go to such elaborate lengths to make it look like an accidental fire? If they were taken, why? What could possibly be worth the enormous effort and risk of kidnapping 5 children and keeping them hidden for life? George and Jennie Sodder devoted their lives to answering these questions. They spent their fortune on private investigators. They maintained their billboard for 4 decades. They followed every lead, no matter how far-fetched. They never gave up hope, and they died without answers. Their surviving children continued the search. Sylvia Sodder Paxton spent her entire 79-year life looking for her siblings, believing they were alive somewhere, hoping that one day she'd get a phone call or a knock on the door. She died in 2021 without ever finding them. The grandchildren of George and Jennie continue to keep the story alive, to advocate for renewed investigation, to hope that someday, somehow, the truth will emerge. But with each passing year, that becomes less likely. The Sodder Children case stands as a testament to the limits of justice, the failures of investigation, and the power of a family's love. It's a reminder that sometimes terrible things happen and we never get answers, that sometimes people disappear and we never know where they went, that sometimes the only thing we can do is remember and keep asking questions and refuse to let the story be forgotten. On Christmas Eve every year, the people of Fayetteville remember the Sodder family. They remember the night the house burned down. They remember the 5 children who disappeared. And they remember George and Jennie standing by their billboard year after year, waiting for their children to come home. The billboard is gone now. George and Jennie are gone. All the surviving children who were there that night are gone. But the mystery endures. The questions remain unanswered. And somewhere in West Virginia, on a cold December night, you can almost imagine you hear Jennie Sodder's voice, still calling out into the darkness. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, where are you? Please come home. If you've been fascinated by this unsolved mystery and want to dive deeper into other baffling cases that continue to haunt us, make sure you're subscribed to Lore 2 Mystery. We explore the darkest corners of unsolved disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and mysteries that refuse to be solved. Every week, we bring you thoroughly researched, in-depth investigations into cases that will keep you up at night. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of mystery seekers. Because some questions demand to be asked, even if we may never find the answers, and the Sodder children deserve to be remembered. What do you think happened on Christmas Eve 1945? Do you believe the children died in the fire, or were they taken? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if you know anyone in the Fayetteville area who might have information about this case, please reach out. After 80 years, it's probably too late to find the children, but it's never too late to find the truth. Thank you for listening to this investigation into one of America's most enduring mysteries. Remember the Sodder children. Remember their family's determination. And remember that somewhere, someone might still know what really happened that Christmas morning in 1945.